What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits for the running back position for week 7 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. Really does help us out if you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Saints at the Cardinals. We are firing up ALVIN KAMARA after 2 back-to-back double-digit fantasy performances in week 5 and in week 6. Week 6 overall, 18.4 fantasy points, 99 yards on the ground, 25 yards through the air. Looks like he is back and fully healthy. There's no question about it. The Cardinals have been pretty decent against running backs so far on this season, but overall, you are lining up KAMARA moving in to the week. I think he's a good start even on a short week. You guys know that I'm not a huge fan of these Thursday night matchups, but I'm fine with KAMARA. There's no way you can afford to sit him with the ceiling that he brings when healthy on a weekly basis. All right, moving on to the Cardinals running backs. We're going to have to kind of sit back throughout the week and evaluate things here. All right, James Conner did not practice on Monday, still dealing with a rib injury, and really Conner has not brought very good ceilings so far on the season, right? 15.5 fantasy points in week 1, 10.7 in week 4. Outside of that, 8.7 or less. And the Cardinals are going to be without wide receiver Hollywood Brown, which is a huge knock to this offense, even with DeAndre Hopkins coming back from suspension and the signing of Robbie Anderson to the receiver position. We don't quite know what to expect out of this offense. Week 6, I thought Benjamin was going to be a smash play going up against Seattle's atrocious run defense, but he finished with just 9.5 fantasy points, 37 yards on the ground, 28 yards through the air. So don't get me wrong, he's a pretty decent start heading into Thursday, but I like Benjamin more as a flex, and really you can only flex him if James Conner is out, because the ceiling that we saw when Conner was out in week 6 wasn't that high. So I think if Conner suits up, I don't know that I like Benjamin. So all things considered, we need to sit back and see what happens throughout the week for the running back position for the Arizona Cardinals before we make any definite decisions. So Wednesday night and Thursday, we'll probably have a better idea of what we want to do here in week 7. All right, moving into Sunday's slate, we've got the Packers at the Commanders. Listen, guys, week to week, the Packers running backs have just been flexes for me because we really just don't know what to expect on a weekly basis, right? We know that Aaron Jones can bring those high ceilings like we saw in week 2 against Chicago with 32 fantasy points, but outside of that, he only has 3 other performances so far on the season with double digits, which is not that bad, right? But no more than 14.5 fantasy points in any of those performances. And when we look at AJ Dillon, outside of that week 1 performance against Minnesota, who's been atrocious against the run, he hasn't given us a single double-digit fantasy performance. So I just don't see very high ceilings for AJ Dillon, and Aaron Jones I think is a fine flex. I'd much rather flex Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon right now, but it does feel like this Packers offense isn't necessarily entirely on the same page. Washington hasn't played awful against opposing running backs so far on the season, so I think it's okay to flex the Packers running backs, but I'd much rather do so with Aaron Jones. I'm not really willing to trust AJ Dillon at this point in the season. All right, looking at the Commanders, I think we go ahead and we start Brian Robinson in week 7. We liked him in week 6. Told you guys kind of hold off, see what happens in week 5. But in week 6, Thursday night football, he looked good against Chicago. 17 rushing attempts, 60 rushing yards, and a score, 12 points in full PPR. We still want to keep an eye on J.D. McKissic and Antonio Gibson to see their usage as well. Gibson was used pretty well through the air on Thursday Night Football, but I would much rather start Brian Robinson. I think Robinson is the only back for the Commanders that I'm confident in starting in week 7. All right, Browns at Ravens. Nick Chubb had his first single-digit fantasy performance on the season. 8 points against New England in week 6, 56 yards on the ground, 1 reception. But hey, you're starting Nick Chubb on a weekly basis. We all know this. He's still a top 2 running back in all scoring formats at the moment. He has been absolutely balling on the season. You cannot afford to sit Nick Chubb, no question about it. I don't think Kareem Hunt is more than a flex, and he should really have an asterisk next to the flex here because he's a very boomer bust option on a weekly basis. Just look at the last 2 weeks. Week 5 against the Chargers, 14.7 points. Granted, they're one of the worst teams against the run in the league. And then week 6 against New England, 1.2 points. So, similar to AJ Dillon on the last slide, you really only want to flex a player like this if you absolutely are desperate. You don't have any other options, because I think the boomer bust in players like Kareem Hunt is too much unless they're going up against a vulnerable defense. All right, moving on to the Ravens running backs. They're a flex for me, but they're not my favorite flex whatsoever, right? You look at J.K. Dobbins, week 4, 22.3 points, week 5, 4.4, week 6, 1.5. What do we do with this backfield who just saw Kenyon Drake go absolutely ballistic in week 6? I don't know, guys. I would much rather just sit them, because the flex is too risky overall, in my opinion. Kenyon Drake, 19.7 points in week 6, but we might see Justice Hill get some action this coming week. We might see Gus Edwards return soon. I am not a fan of the Ravens backfield. I haven't been all season long, but with a couple of bye weeks here in week 7, you might have to consider players like AJ Dillon, Kareem Hunt, J.K. Dobbins. It's just these players come with a lot of volatility, so they are no more than flexes for me moving into week 7. All right, Buccaneers at Panthers. The Panthers continue to be very bad against opposing running backs. And when we look at Leonard Fournette, he is getting a lot of touches. 21 touches in week 6 against Pittsburgh, 22.1 fantasy points, 63 yards on the ground, 6 targets, 6 receptions, a receiving touchdown as well. And I said this at the beginning of the season, right? We weren't seeing Fournette involved in the passing game, but if he starts to get involved in the passing game, which we've really seen since week 3, he is going to bring a lot more fantasy value. That's why he ranked where he did last year as a top 6 running back, and right now in full PPR, he is your RB5. So you cannot afford to sit Leonard Fournette. He is definitely very valuable from a fantasy perspective, and he is in our lineups moving into week 7. And similar to Fournette, we cannot afford to sit Christian McCaffrey, your RB3 in full PPR, 22.8 points in week 6, 69 rushing yards and 89 receiving yards. Doesn't have to find the end zone to give you a good fantasy stat line. We really don't need to have a lot of discussion here. 13 or more points in every game so far on the season. In his last 3 games, 22 or more points for Christian McCaffrey. He is in your starting lineup on a weekly basis. All right, Falcons at Bengals. Tyler Algier and Caleb Huntley essentially saw a even split last week. Caleb Huntley had 16 rushing attempts for 59 rushing yards, and Tyler Algier had 15 rushing attempts for 51 rushing yards. Neither of them scored, right? If either of them can find the end zone, I think they can give you a respectable fantasy stat line, but you're only going to consider starting either of these players if you're absolutely desperate due to the bye weeks or maybe injuries this week, and you're just crossing your fingers. You got a 50-50 shot of one of them potentially finding the end zone. So I think for majority of fantasy owners, they are sits moving into week 7. All right, looking at Joe Mixon, quietly having a good season. He's still a top 12 running back in full PPR, 16.8 points in week 6, 45 yards on the ground, 23 yards through the air, and 1 receiving touchdown. Listen, the ceilings haven't been great for Mixon, but he is still extremely consistent, and he is still in our lineups on a weekly basis as we approach week 7. All right, Lions at Cowboys. The Cowboys defense is good. We all know this, right? But they did give up a lot of yards last week to the Eagles running backs. So I think you can confidently flex the Lions running backs. At this point, at the time I'm recording this, we don't know if DeAndre Swift is going to play in week 7. If he does play, he should be in your lineups. He's way too talented to not have in your starting lineups. And at this point in the season, you're probably in a position where he is a good flex option for you, and you hopefully have an RB1 and RB2 in front of him. If you own Jamal Williams, I still think you can flex him, but if Swift is out there, there's a potential for a lower ceiling. But even with that being said, Williams has given us good enough fantasy performances and gotten double-digit fantasy performances on the season with Swift out there. So I love these Lions running backs, but I think they have to be flexes, especially with the offense kind of starting to trend down. And with Dallas's defense, you know, even with the not the best performance in week 6, they are still a stout defense overall. So I think we flex the Lions running backs moving into week 7, and hopefully if you own DeAndre Swift, he is out there for you guys. I really want to see him get back to action. Okay, on a weekly basis for me, the Cowboys running backs have just been flexes. Tony Pollard had 7.2 fantasy points in week 6, 44 yards on the ground. He added 2 receptions. Ezekiel Elliott looked good against Eagles, man. 81 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, 1 reception for 5 receiving yards, 15.6 fantasy points on the night. But if we go to the week before, Tony Pollard had 14.6 fantasy points and Zeke had 7.8. So really, it's just back and forth with these 2 running backs. They're both extremely talented, right? We know Dak Prescott might make his return in week 7, which could help, you know, give this offense a little bit of a boost. But the key part of this matchup is that the Lions' run defense has been absolutely atrocious. So I will say, out of all these different options that we're just looking at flexing running backs on their respective teams, I really do like the Cowboys running backs heading in to week 7. All right, moving on to the Giants at Jaguars. You're starting Saquon Barkley, no questions asked. RB1 in full PPR, RB2 in standard scoring formats. 18.5 fantasy points in week 6, 83 yards on the ground, 1 touchdown and 3 receptions. There's no way you were thinking about sitting Saquon Barkley. And hey, we got to give it to this Giants team and this Giants offense. They are playing pretty damn good football overall. All right, Travis Etienne is on the rise. James Robinson is on the downward trend. Man, I really love seeing James Robinson, you know, beginning of the season, getting back into the swing of things. But it looks like Etienne is starting to become the lead back for this team. Double-digit fantasy performances in his last 2 matchups. Well, James Robinson has no more than 6.5 points in his last 2 matchups. So I think you roll with Travis Etienne this week against the Giants. 12.8 fantasy points last week, 86 yards on the ground, 2 receptions. I think he is the back to start. I think, unfortunately, James Robinson is going to be the running back to sit as we approach week 7. Right, Colts at Titans. I think we need to sit back this week and watch the Colts backfield. We know that Jonathan Taylor is still dealing with his ankle injury. We know that Nyheim Hines is still dealing with a concussion. And we know that Deion Jackson can fill in very nicely, but he also got injured in Sunday's matchup after putting up 28.1 fantasy points, 42 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 10 total receptions for 79 receiving yards. I mean, what a day for Deion Jackson. But there's just not enough information here at the time I'm recording this to really know what direction this backfield is going to be moving into as we approach week 7. I think they're all worth a start to some degree, depending on who's injured and who's not against the Titans. But at the time I'm recording this, we just don't know who's going to be healthy and available. So we're going to have to monitor the Colts running backs moving into week 7. Derrick Henry, on the other hand, is still a top 10 running back on the season, and in his last 3 performances, he's given you 23 or more fantasy points. Obviously, the Titans were on bye week in week 6, but I think you continue to roll with Derrick Henry. I doubt if you own Derrick Henry, you're thinking about sitting him. He is a start on a weekly basis. Texans at Raiders. I like both running backs in this matchup, both on an upward trend before getting a bye week in week 6. Dameon Pierce has given you 16.1 or more fantasy points with a high of 25.9 in his last 3 matchups. You are rolling full steam ahead with Dameon Pierce in your starting lineups against the Raiders in week 7. Looking at Josh Jacobs, he's given you 13.7 or more fantasy points in his last 3 matchups with a high of 34.5 fantasy points as well as 30.3 in week 5. No reason to sit Dameon Pierce or Josh Jacobs as we move into week 7. They are both phenomenal starts. Jets at Broncos, a little bit of a tough matchup for Breece Hall. Probably his toughest matchup on the season, but I don't care, man. You're starting Breece Hall. We are riding this momentum all the way. This is going to be a fun matchup, man. The Jets defense starting to hum a little bit. Their offense, in terms of their run game, has been on fire. Breece Hall moved up to RB6 overall in full PPR. His last 5 matchups, at least 13 fantasy points with a high of 27.7 in week 5. And then week 6, 20.1 fantasy points against Green Bay, 116 rushing yards, a score, and 2 receptions. Like I said, a tough matchup against Denver and a couple tough matchups coming up here. I mean, we got New England in week 8 and Buffalo in week 9. But guys, I'm telling you, Breece Hall is going to be a start for me on a weekly basis. All right, looking at the Broncos running backs, the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played and Melvin Gordon is still questionable for tonight, so I don't know if we're going to see more of Mike Boone or less of Mike Boone and more of Melvin Gordon. I don't exactly know, but in week 5 we had 15 rushing attempts for Melvin Gordon and just 7 for Mike Boone. I think, you know, they're probably worth a flex depending on how they play in Monday Night Football, but we just need to keep an eye on them throughout the week and an eye on them in the Monday Night Football game before we make our calls moving into week 7. All right, Chiefs at Niners is a tough matchup for Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who has given us single-digit fantasy performances in his last 2 matchups. Dropped a touchdown in week 5 that would have helped out his stat line, but just 6.5 points in week 5 and then 3.3 against Buffalo. Although Buffalo's been pretty good against opposing running backs and the game script didn't necessarily help him. But regardless, with the matchup and with how the last 2 weeks have looked, CEH moves down to a flex for me. I don't necessarily think he's the worst flex. Still brings some nice upside, and especially being a part of the Chiefs offense, coming in as RB13 overall, but this should be a good matchup overall. So hopefully the game script, you know, kind of helps CEH overall. Especially we want to see that red zone usage come back that we saw in the first couple weeks of the season. So moving into 7, CEH becomes a flex for me. Looking at Jeff Wilson, who was held in check in week 6 against Atlanta. I mean, essentially a goose egg, 0.5 fantasy points after having double-digit fantasy performances in the 4 weeks prior to that. I mean, he fumbled early in this game and just didn't get back on track. And then the Niners were playing from behind against the Falcons. I mean, people just didn't, you know, no one expected to see that, right? But I think Jeff Wilson redeems himself in week 7 and gives you another respectable stat line. And Kansas City has not played very well against opposing running backs, so I think you can start Jeff Wilson with pretty good confidence moving into week 7. Seahawks at Chargers. Kenneth Walker's season is here, man. Let's get it. 19 fantasy points in week 6, 97 rushing yards, a touchdown, and 2 receptions. Guys, he looks great on the ground. He is going to be a must start on a weekly basis, and he might be my must start running back of the week because this Chargers defense is absolutely atrocious against opposing running backs. Kenneth Walker is in your starting lineups. He's locked in as an RB2, and if you're fortunate enough, he's locked in as a flex option for you with a solid RB1 and RB2 in front of him. Austin Ekeler continues to be a start on a weekly basis, moved back to RB4 at the time I'm recording this, but he could move up depending on how things go Monday Night Football. And quite frankly, I don't really care how they go. In full PPR, he's giving you double-digit fantasy performances every single week of the season. In week 4 and 5, his 2 best fantasy performances. Gets a tough matchup in week 6 against Denver. But moving into week 7, the Seahawks are atrocious against opposing running backs. This should be a great game script, a great matchup for both running backs involved here in week 7. All right, Steelers at Dolphins. I think you can flex Najee Harris. He still gets kind of downgraded here, but he gave us his first double-digit fantasy performance since week 3, his second best fantasy performance on the season against a very good run defense in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 42 yards on the ground, 2 receptions, including a receiving touchdown. So I just don't think the ceilings are really that high for Najee Harris. But just 2 weeks ago, the Jets absolutely tore up this Dolphins defense from the running back position. So I do think he could have a decent day for sure. But just with the way this offense is operating at the moment, he's no more than a flex for me moving into week 7. All right, RAHEEM Mostert absolutely disappointed in week 6 against a bad Minnesota Vikings run defense, and Chase Edmonds didn't do much in this game either. They both had 5.8 or less fantasy points, and that was after Mostert absolutely tore up the Jets and essentially the Bengals the week before. So I think Mostert gets moved down to a flex against Pittsburgh, Leonard Fournette played very well against this defense in week 6. So I think you can start Mostert in the flex position, but I wouldn't do anything outside of that. And I think Chase Edmonds continues to be a running back that we sit on a weekly basis until a more consistent pattern emerges. So I like Harris and I like Mostert, but I'm a little wary of them. So their flexes here for me in week 7. All right, Bears at Patriots. I'm starting David Montgomery. This Patriots defense played very well against Nick Chubb and company in week 6, but Montgomery continues to be a flex option. 18.2 points against Minnesota in week 5, then just 9 against Washington. So I don't expect a very high ceiling, but if you need to, I do think Montgomery is a perfectly fine flex, but I wouldn't do much more with him than that unless you absolutely have to. On the other hand, Rhamondre Stevenson has moved up to RB9 on the season in full PPR, 25.1 points in week 6, his best fantasy performance on the season. 76 rushing yards, 2 scores, and 4 receptions. He's in your starting lineups at this point. If you can flex him, that's even better, but he is a start for your roster on a weekly basis. But we do need to keep an eye on Damien Harris throughout the week. I still think Rhamondre Stevenson, who has 12.9 or more fantasy points in his last 4 performances, is the player with the upside, regardless of if Damien Harris is good to go here in week 7 or not. He was out in week 6, missed most of week 5 as well, but I would just continue to ride the hot hand with Stevenson. And if Harris is good to go, I still think he's an okay flex. But like I said, Stevenson holds the upside. He's the running back in this backfield that we want to start moving into week 7. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.